What if the biggest move President Donald J. Trump just made didn't look like a move at all? No speech, no invasion, no headline. And that silence is exactly why this entire hemisphere is starting to shift. Well, if you're exhausted by chaos, confused by whiplash headlines, and just tired of watching America react instead of lead, this matters to you. Because while Washington argued and cable news chased outrage, Cuba quietly began to break, and not by accident. Now, this wasn't sanctions theater. This wasn't posturing. This was leverage. Now, here's the clarity, guys. The United States didn't invade Cuba. It didn't need to. The credibility, well, this actually comes straight from how power actually works. Energy flows, shipping lanes, the dependency chains that run through Venezuela and ripple outward toward vessels like China and Russia. And of course, the comprehension. Once you see the board, the pieces start to make sense. Why Greenland suddenly matters, why elites are panicking, and why this didn't start with Cuba, and it won't end there either. They actually thought that this was about one island, but it wasn't. This is about who controls the hemisphere and who comes next. Stick with me, guys, because once you see the dominoes, you can't unsee them. Hit the like button, subscribe. All right, check this out. Here's what most people missed. Donald J. Trump didn't announce a crackdown on Cuba. He didn't deploy troops. There was basically no primetime address to be made. There was no war resolution, no invasion footage looping on cable news, and that silence is the point. The decision was non-kinetic and it was already executed, meaning we're not guessing about outcomes. We're watching consequences unfold in real time. Now, here's the part most people are missing. This was never about Cuba alone. This was about leverage across the Western Hemisphere. Cuba sits 90 miles from Florida. Really, I think it's like 90 miles from like the Florida Keys or something like that. Brittle, externally dependent, and strategically exposed. Pressure that doesn't look like pressure works fastest on systems like that. But by choosing restraint over spectacle, Donald J. Trump, he denied Havana a rallying cry. He denied the media storyline. No tanks means no martyrs. No speeches means no countdown. The move is complete. So what you're seeing right now, blackouts, shortages, panic, this is the aftermath, not the plan. So this is not like a moral argument. This is a mechanical one. Now, for more than 2 decades, Cuba survived on oil and subsidies from Venezuela, a pipeline that was built under Hugo Chavez and ultimately maintained by Nicolas Maduro. Now, at peak, Venezuela sent roughly 100,000 barrels a day. Over 20 years, that support amounted to more than $60 billion in indirect aid. So what did Cuba send back? Dictators, intelligence services, and internal security forces that helped keep the Venezuelan regime in power. Now, that exchange kept Havana afloat. Without it, the math collapses. Without that oil, Cuba doesn't have an economy. It has a blackout schedule, rolling outages, food lines, and currency failure. Those aren't policy choices. They're arithmetic. Once Venezuela stabilized, Cuba was mathematically next. No ideology required, just numbers. Now, what happened to Cuba is what happens when a system looks stable on the surface, but the support underneath quietly disappears. There's no foundation. And that same mistake shows up closer to home than most people want to admit. Assuming your Medicare plan is fine, that's an expensive assumption. Now, one viewer assumed and ended up paying $480 that she didn't have to. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no warning. There was no emergency. Her plan just quietly failed her when it mattered the most. This is exactly why I partner with Chapter. Chapter replaces assumptions with facts by reviewing your Medicare coverage line by line before a missed detail turns into a bill that you just weren't prepared for. And they're not selling fear either. There's no salesman there. They're just fixing the blind spots. Now, most people, they're already dialing the phone number at the bottom of your screen right there, 909-563-8279, or they're clicking the link that I left for you down below, askchapter.org/Ron, to make sure that the plan that they're relying on actually does what they think it does. Oh, and I also want to thank Ed for sharing this under a recent video. He said, saving $684 a year thanks to Ron and Chapter. Huge savings for an 84 years young senior on a fixed income. I love it. So anyway, let's get back to it. This is where the dominoes actually started falling. Venezuela wasn't the headline. It was the keystone. And when that keystone cracked, every regime leaning on it felt the weight shift instantly. The U.S. operation moved fast, quietly, and decisively. Air defense systems tied to Russia and China were neutralized. A narco regime figure protected by Cuban security networks was extracted. No American lives lost, no prolonged engagement. Use one image and one only only. The queen was removed from the board. And the consequence wasn't chaos, it was recalculation. Havana recalculated, Tehran recalculated, Moscow and Beijing recalculated. Because this proves something uncomfortable. The United States, under President Donald J. Trump, could dismantle a critical node without triggering a national war. That's why this matters. When the keystone falls, the arch doesn't argue. It collapses. Now, to really understand what's happening right now, you have to understand how Donald J. Trump sees the board. He's not operating as a Cold War theorist. He's not exporting democracy or chasing moral victories. His lens is leverage, pure and simple. Geography matters, shipping lanes matter, energy choke points matter, psychological dominance matters. Now, this is the Monroe Doctrine revived, not as a museum piece, but as an operating logic. The Western Hemisphere is treated as strategic ground, not as a charity project. Contrast that with Bush-era nation building that drained blood and treasure, or how about Obama-era globalism that outsourced leverage to institutions that couldn't enforce it? Here's the signpost. This isn't about fixing Cuba. This is about reminding every actor from Havana to Brasilia to Beijing whose backyard this is and what happens when dependency chains are exposed. Ideology argues. Leverage ends arguments. And that's the shift that elites weren't prepared for. So this is the part that unsettles people the most. Donald J. Trump didn't invade Cuba, and that decision removed the regime's last line of defense. An invasion creates a villain. It creates a martyr. It basically gives a failing system something external to blame. By refusing that spectacle, Trump forced Havana to own its own collapse in real time, right in front of its own people. No invasion means no rally. No bombs means no foreign enemy to curse on state television. The failure becomes internal, visible, and undeniable. Lights go out, food disappears, wages don't buy bread, and there's no outside aggressor to point at. Now, this isn't about aggression. This is about inevitability. Pressure applied without theatrics works like gravity, slow, constant, and impossible to argue with. The result's not chaos, it's exhaustion. And exhausted systems don't resist, they give way. So this is where it becomes bigger than Cuba. Enter Greenland, not as a distraction, but as proof of scale. So while critics mock the idea, the logic just never changed. First, rare earth minerals. China controls much of the world's refining capacity, and Trump understands that dependency is vulnerability. Greenland breaks that stranglehold inside the Western Hemisphere. Second, shipping. So as Arctic routes open, whoever controls access controls trade. The Northwest Passage isn't theoretical anymore. It's leverage waiting to be claimed. Third, missile defense geometry. And any threat launched from Russia toward North America passes over this region. Greenland becomes a shield, not just a map pin. Mention nuke if you want realism, but understand the point. This strategy scales. Cuba was the pressure test. Greenland is the expansion. Now, the panic that you're seeing right now from the global elites isn't about Cuba collapsing or Greenland entering the conversation. This is really about something deeper, loss of predictability. Now, for decades, power operated through committees, summits, and institutions that required consensus before anything moved. Now, what President Donald J. Trump has demonstrated is that none of this is required anymore. This strategy doesn't rely on permission. It doesn't depend on the UN, the EU, or multi-layered buy-in. And most unsettling of all, it works without firing shots. One move alters supply chains. Another reshapes alliances. A third changes behavior without a single vote or a treaty. Now, think of it kind of like removing the floor plan from a building while people are still inside of it. Everyone can feel the shift, but no one knows where to step next. That uncertainty right there, that's fear. Because when predictability dies, leverage belongs to whoever set the rules, and right now, that's Washington, D.C. So if you really want to understand how all of this connects, just follow the energy. The United States isn't just energy independent, it's becoming the anchor supplier for the Western Hemisphere. Now, that reality quietly erodes the power of OPEC and sidelines energy leverage once held by the rivals. So this is why Venezuela matters beyond politics. It holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, yet socialism left them stranded, untapped, unusable, and decaying. Under a different system, those reserves became influence again. Under President Donald Trump's approach, energy flows determine who has leverage and who doesn't. Now, here's the fresh angle most people miss. Hostile states, they don't threaten what they no longer control. When energy dependency shifts westward, so does power. This isn't just economics, it's strategy. And once energy stops being a weapon against the United States, entire regions lose their bargaining chip. So while attention stays fixed on the Caribbean, the same pressure model is quietly breaking Iran. Now, this isn't coincidence. This is a pattern. Inflation has surged past 50%. The rival has collapsed to historic lows. The average Iranian earns barely enough to survive. Meanwhile, rent costs more than double a monthly income. So when people can't eat, regimes don't posture, they fracture. So here's what changed. Iran no longer holds the world hostage through oil. Under Donald J. Trump, sanctions weren't symbolic, they were isolating. The Abraham Accords locked Israel together with Sunni Arab states, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and quietly Saudi Arabia, cutting off Iran right at its own neighborhood. Now that isolation has consequences. Tehran can't fund Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraqi militias, or even the Houthis the way that they once did. The axis of resistance is thinning because the fuel line is gone. This is not escalation. This is attrition, and it's working. Now, if we step back a little bit and we look at the pattern that's forming here, the world isn't organizing around ideology anymore. It's reorganizing around power blocks, civilization states. The United States consolidates the Western Hemisphere. China tightens its grip on East Asia. Russia reasserts itself across Eurasia. India rises in its own sphere. Now, what's unsettling to elites is how fast this is happening right now and how little negotiation is involved. Now, under Donald J. Trump, the United States is not asking for permission to lead its region. It's enforcing gravity. Smaller states align because resistance becomes impractical, not because speeches persuade them. So this is why small moves now have massive consequences. A pressure point in Cuba ripples to Tehran. A conversation about Greenland shakes Europe. So once the board shifts, every piece must move or get swept aside. Now, once the keystone breaks, the rest of the structure adjusts. I mean, look, across Latin America, the political math, it's changing. Not because of speeches, but because incentives shifted. Argentina is already recalibrating toward market discipline. El Salvador, they chose security and sovereignty over lectures. Chile is reassessing years of ideological drift. And Colombia is widely forecast to basically move toward a pro-U.S. alignment as voters react to economic strain and regional instability. Now, here is the fresh angle. Dominoes don't fall simultaneously. They fall after the support beam gives way. When Donald J. Trump reasserted leverage in the hemisphere, it changed risk calculations for every capital south of the Rio Grande. Alignment stopped being philosophical and it became practical. That's when shifts accelerate, quietly, then all at once. So this is where the loop closes. Cuba was never the end game. It was just simply proof of concept. A fragile system propped up by dependency, positioned close enough to matter, and exposed enough to respond to pressure without spectacle. The lesson wasn't that collapse is desirable. It's that leverage works when you remove theatrics. They thought it was about Cuba, but it wasn't about Cuba. It was actually about demonstrating that the United States can reshape outcomes without occupying territory, without begging institutions, and without announcing timelines. Once that lesson landed, everything else followed. Energy realignments, strategic expansions, political recalculations. What you're watching right now isn't escalation, it's inevitability. The move already happened. The fallout is exactly what happens next. And in a world reorganizing around power, test cases don't get repeated, they get studied. In the pinned comment down below.